Hey guys, tonight we descend into the muddy, backbreaking, and occasionally plague-ridden world of Tudor England, where your greatest aspiration was probably not dying of dysentery before harvest time. So, before you get comfortable in your climate-controlled room with running water and indoor plumbing, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me tell you, what we're diving into today makes modern complaints about inflation look like minor inconveniences over a latte. Picture this. You wake up tomorrow morning, but instead of checking your phone and complaining about your commute, you're staring at a thatched roof that's probably harboring more wildlife than a nature preserve. And your biggest concern isn't whether your Wi-Fi is working, it's whether you'll survive until Christmas. In this world, your career prospects were determined entirely by the circumstances of your birth. Upward mobility meant maybe not starving this winter, and your retirement plan was basically hoping your children didn't abandon you to die in a ditch. Let's be clear about something right from the start. If you think life is hard now, you're about to gain a whole new perspective on what constitutes genuine hardship. We're talking about an era where a simple cut could kill you, where bathing was considered suspicious behavior, and where your entire worldview was shaped by the fact that literally everyone around you was trying not to die from things we can now cure with a trip to CVS. To be fair, Tudor England wasn't uniformly miserable for everyone. If you happened to be born into the landed gentry, had connections at court, or possessed some miraculous combination of luck and ruthlessness, you might have lived quite well. But statistically speaking, you'd have been a peasant farmer, which means your life would have been a fascinating study in human endurance, community cooperation, and creative problem-solving in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. And yet, somehow, millions of people not only survived, but created families, built communities, developed rich cultural traditions, and laid the groundwork for everything that would follow. That's right. These weren't just statistics in a history book. They were real people with hopes, dreams, frustrations, and small moments of joy, just like us. The only difference was that their version of a bad day might involve watching their entire year's crop rot in the field, while ours involves running out of battery on our smartphones. So you've opened your eyes in Tudor England, sometime between 1485 and 1603. Congratulations. You've just become part of what historians generously call the backbone of English society, which is academic speak for the people who do all the actual work while everyone else takes credit for it. Sound familiar? Your new home is what estate agents of the time would have optimistically called a cozy cottage with character, which translates to a 1 or 2 room structure made of whatever materials happen to be locally available and cheap. If you're lucky, you're living in a region with good building stone or decent timber. If you're unlucky, and let's be honest, as a poor farmer, you're probably unlucky. Your house is made of wattle and daub, which is essentially sticks, mud, and hope held together by prayer and the occasional miracle. Meanwhile, while you're contemplating your new accommodations, let me paint you a picture of what home sweet home actually means in this context. The walls are about as thick as a modern paperback novel. The windows are either non-existent or covered with oiled cloth if you're feeling fancy, and the floor is packed earth that becomes a delightful mud pit every time it rains. Your furniture consists of whatever you or your neighbors could cobble together from available wood, which means everything wobbles, nothing matches, and comfort is a concept that won't be invented for several more centuries. Let's talk about privacy, or rather, the complete absence thereof. Your entire family, and we're talking parents, children, maybe a grandparent or two, possibly some extended relatives who've fallen on hard times, all live in this space together. The concept of a bedroom doesn't exist. You sleep wherever there's space to lay down some straw and a blanket. If you thought sharing a bathroom with roommates was challenging, try sharing a single room with 8 people. and no plumbing whatsoever. To be fair, this communal living arrangement does have some advantages that modern individualistic society has lost. When everyone lives in such close quarters, you develop remarkable skills in conflict resolution, patience, and the art of selective hearing. You learn to find moments of solitude in the middle of chaos, and you appreciate small pleasures in ways that people with abundant privacy simply can't understand. Your yard, if we can call it that, is a fascinating ecosystem of domestic animals, vegetable gardens, herb patches, and various piles of materials that might come in handy someday. The chickens roam freely, which means you're constantly watching where you step. The pigs contribute their own special ambiance to the atmosphere. And your cow, if you're fortunate enough to have one, is probably worth more than everything else you own combined. Of course, this bucolic scene comes with its own set of challenges that modern homeowners simply don't face. Your neighbors aren't just people who live nearby. They're your economic partners, your insurance policy, your entertainment system, and your emergency response team all rolled into one. When someone's house catches fire, and houses catch fire regularly because everything is made of flammable materials and heating involves open flames, the entire community drops everything to help. When harvest time comes, everyone works. Everyone else's fields in rotation because no family can handle the workload alone. And yet, this interdependence creates a social fabric that's both remarkably strong and incredibly fragile. Everyone knows everyone else's business because privacy is literally impossible, which means gossip travels faster than wildfire, and social pressure is intense enough to shape behavior in ways that modern social media can barely touch. If you want to understand how communities maintain order without police forces or courts, just imagine living in a place where your reputation affects not just your social standing but your family's literal survival. Still, don't romanticize this too much. The flip side of tight-knit community support is that there's nowhere to hide when things go wrong, no way to escape social expectations, and absolutely no tolerance for what we consider individual self-expression. Your life is governed by traditions that stretch back centuries, customs that make perfect sense given the circumstances, but would seem impossibly restrictive to modern sensibilities. By the time you've been awake for an hour in your new Tudor life, you've already encountered more challenges to your worldview than most people face in a month. The smell alone, a complex bouquet of unwashed humans, domestic animals, wood smoke, and various organic processes would probably send a modern person running for the nearest Starbucks. But this is your reality now, and complaining about it won't change anything. If you thought adapting to a new city was difficult, think again. You're not just dealing with a different place. You're dealing with a completely different understanding of what it means to be human, what constitutes success, and what you can reasonably expect from life. The good news is that humans are remarkably adaptable creatures, and your new neighbors have been making this lifestyle work for generations. Let's be honest about something. If you think your current job is demanding, you're about to discover what genuine occupational hazard actually means. Your new career as a Tudor farmer doesn't come with vacation days, sick leave, or workers' compensation. Instead, it comes with a simple arrangement: work constantly or starve. That's right. Your employment contract is written by Mother Nature herself, and she's a notoriously harsh boss. Your workday begins before dawn, not because you're particularly ambitious, but because daylight is a precious resource that you literally cannot afford to waste. Candles are expensive, oil lamps are a luxury, and electricity won't be invented for another few centuries. So you learn to sync your entire existence with the sun's schedule. Meanwhile, while you're fumbling around in the pre-dawn darkness, trying to figure out which end of the cow needs milking, remember that this is your life every single day, regardless of weather, mood, or how you're feeling. The concept of weekends is about as foreign to your new reality as the concept of retirement accounts or health insurance. Sunday might involve going to church, and by might, I mean absolutely will, because not going is both socially unacceptable and potentially illegal. But the animals still need feeding. The crops still need tending, and urgent tasks don't. Pause for religious observances. Let me walk you through a typical day in your new agricultural paradise. You wake up, assuming you actually slept, which isn't guaranteed given the combination of uncomfortable sleeping arrangements. Snoring family members and various nocturnal creatures who've taken up residence in your thatch roof, and immediately assess the weather situation. This isn't casual morning planning. This is strategic intelligence gathering that will determine everything about your day. To be fair, weather forecasting in Tudor times was more art than science, which means you're essentially gambling with your family's survival every time you make decisions based on what the sky looks like. Rain could save your crops or destroy them, depending on timing. Wind could dry your grain or blow your roof off. Sunshine could ripen your harvest or wither your plants into expensive compost. Your first task involves dealing with livestock, which sounds simple until you remember that animals are living creatures with their own agendas, and those agendas rarely align with your schedule. Cows need milking whether or not you're in the mood. Pigs need feeding whether or not you have food to spare. And chickens need their eggs collected before they decide to go broody and stop laying altogether. Sound familiar? It should, because anyone who's ever dealt with demanding clients, unreasonable deadlines, or uncooperative technology will recognize the fundamental challenge of managing entities that don't care about your convenience. The difference is that when your computer crashes, you don't starve. When your cow stops producing milk, your family's protein source just disappeared. The bulk of your day involves fieldwork, which is a euphemistic way of saying backbreaking. Labor performed with tools that would be considered primitive by ancient Roman standards. Your plow is pulled by oxen if you're prosperous, by horses if you're moderately successful, or by you and your family members if fortune hasn't smiled upon your household. The efficiency of your farming operation depends entirely on muscle power. Yours, your animals. And whatever help you can get from neighbors during critical seasons. Of course, fieldwork isn't just about planting and harvesting. It's about soil preparation, seed selection, pest management, weed control, irrigation planning, and storage logistics, all performed without the benefit of modern agricultural science, weather services, or reliable markets. You're essentially running a complex operation based on traditional knowledge, local wisdom, and educated guessing. And yet, somehow, this system worked well enough to support entire civilizations. The agricultural techniques that seem so primitive to modern eyes were actually sophisticated approaches developed over centuries of trial and error, passed down through generations of farmers who understood their local conditions better than any modern agricultural extension agent. Still, let's not romanticize the reality. Farm work in Tudor England was dangerous in ways that modern occupational safety regulations specifically prevent. Sharp tools, unpredictable animals, unstable structures, and hazardous working conditions were just part of the job. People regularly suffered injuries that would be considered minor inconveniences today, but were potentially fatal in a world without modern medical care. Meanwhile, while you're struggling with the physical demands of agricultural labor, you're also managing what amounts to a small business operation. You need to plan crop rotations, manage livestock breeding, maintain equipment, negotiate with neighbors for shared resources, and somehow generate enough surplus to pay taxes, tithes, and rent while feeding your family by the end of each day. You're not just physically exhausted. You're mentally drained from making dozens of complex, decisions with incomplete information, and potentially catastrophic consequences. If you thought modern work stress was challenging, try running an operation where crop failure means your children don't eat, where animal disease means you lose your primary capital investment, and where bad weather could destroy months of labor in a single afternoon. If you thought ... think again. This isn't a lifestyle choice or a temporary phase. This is your reality for as long as you live, assuming you're fortunate enough to live long enough to complain about it. The retirement plan is hoping your children will take care of you when you're too old to work, assuming they survive to adulthood and don't move away to find better opportunities. Let's be clear about your position in Tudor society. You're at the bottom of a social pyramid, so rigid that it makes modern class systems look like gentle suggestions. The good news is that everyone knows exactly where they stand relative to everyone else, which eliminates a lot of social anxiety about status. The bad news is that where you stand is roughly equivalent to where the foundation stones would be. If society were a building, essential for everything else to work, but rarely acknowledged and definitely not glamorous, your social superiors include basically everyone who isn't also a poor farmer, which creates an interesting dynamic where you're simultaneously crucial to society's functioning and completely invisible to most of the people making decisions that affect your life. To be fair, this invisibility does come with certain advantages. When kings and nobles are fighting over power, peasants are generally left alone to get on with the actual work of keeping civilization running. The person you're most likely to interact with directly is your landlord, who might be a minor gentleman, a yeoman farmer who's done well for himself, or a representative of some distant noble who owns half the county. This relationship is the cornerstone of your entire existence, and it's governed by traditions so ancient that nobody remembers why they exist, only that they absolutely must be maintained. Your rent isn't paid in money, partly because money is scarce at your social level, but mostly because the entire economic system is based on agricultural products and labor services. You owe your landlord a percentage of your crop, a certain number of days of work on his land, and various other obligations that might include everything from repairing fences to providing transportation services when needed. Sound familiar? It should, because anyone who's ever felt trapped by financial obligations they can't escape will recognize the fundamental dynamic at play. The difference is that modern debt can theoretically be paid off, while your fuel obligations are permanent. Features of your social position that will be inherited by your children and their children after them. Meanwhile, while you're navigating this complex web of obligations, you're also part of a village community that operates according to its own internal hierarchy. The village has its own social structure, with certain families holding more influence based on their length of residence, their success as farmers, their connections to powerful people, or simply their skill at navigating local politics. The most important person in your immediate world is probably the village reeve, who's responsible for organizing collective activities, representing the village to outside authorities, and mediating disputes between neighbors. This position rotates among the more successful villagers, and it's both an honor and a burden. You get respect and influence, but you also get responsibility for problems that have no good solutions. Of course, social mobility isn't completely impossible, but it requires either extraordinary circumstances or generational effort. A particularly successful farmer might accumulate enough resources to rent additional land, eventually becoming a minor landlord himself. A family might send one son to become a priest, which provides education and potentially access to higher social circles. A daughter might marry slightly above her station if she's particularly attractive or skilled. And yet, these opportunities are rare enough that most people live their entire lives in the same social position where they were born, surrounded by the same people, following the same routines, with the same limited horizons. The concept of finding yourself or pursuing your dreams would be literally incomprehensible to someone whose entire existence is defined by inherited obligations and traditional expectations. Still, don't assume that social hierarchy means social isolation. Village life creates its own forms of community and belonging that transcend individual social positions. The annual harvest festival treats everyone as part of the same celebration, regardless of their specific status. Community. Work projects bring people together across family lines. Marriages create connections that weave the entire village into a complex network of relationships taught by modern standards. The restrictions on individual freedom would seem intolerable. But remember that individual freedom, as we understand, is a relatively recent concept. In Tudor times, identity came from community membership, security came from fulfilling traditional roles, and happiness came from successfully meeting social expectations rather than from personal achievement or self-expression. If you thought social media created pressure to conform, think again. Village life meant that everyone knew everything about everyone. Gossip traveled faster than news from London, and social pressure was applied constantly through dozens of small interactions. Every day. Your reputation wasn't just about how people perceived you. It directly affected your family's economic opportunities, your children's marriage prospects, and your access to community support during emergencies. That's right. Privacy, individualism, and personal autonomy weren't just unavailable. They were literally unthinkable concepts that wouldn't be invented for several more centuries. Your identity was inseparable from your role in the community, your family's history, and your position in the social hierarchy that surrounded you. To be fair, this system did provide certain benefits that modern individualistic society has lost. Everyone had a place, everyone had a role, and everyone knew what was expected of them. Social safety nets weren't government programs. They were community obligations built into the fabric of daily life. When disaster struck, help came from neighbors who understood that they might need similar help someday. Meanwhile, the broader political world operated according to principles that would be familiar to anyone who's ever worked in a large corporation or bureaucracy. Power flowed downward through established channels. Information moved slowly and was often distorted by the time it reached your level. And decisions that profoundly affected your life were made by people who had never met you and never would. Let's be honest about something that might shock your modern sensibilities. In Tudor England, food wasn't a matter of preference or lifestyle choice. It was literally a matter of life and death, and the margin between adequate nutrition and starvation was thinner than a modern diet plan's promise of quick results. Your relationship with food would be more intimate, more precarious, and more fundamentally important than anything most people today can imagine. Your diet consists primarily of whatever you can grow, raise, preserve, or acquire through barter with your neighbors. The concept of grocery stores, global supply chains, or year-round availability of fresh produce belongs to a future so distant it might as well be science fiction. Instead, your meals are dictated by the seasons, the weather, your farming success, and the ancient art of making a little bit of everything stretch as far as possible. Bread is the cornerstone of your existence, but not the fluffy, white, processed bread that modern people take for granted. Your bread is made from whatever grains you've managed to grow and successfully preserve. Wheat, if you're doing well, barley or oats if you're getting by, and increasingly creative combinations of available ingredients if times are tough. The quality varies dramatically based on your circumstances, and a bad harvest year means bread that's more filler than grain. To be fair, this bread is probably more nutritious than modern processed alternatives, assuming it's made with decent ingredients and doesn't contain too many adulterants that dishonest millers might add to stretch their supplies. Medieval bakers were remarkably skilled at working with inconsistent ingredients and primitive equipment, creating complex flavors and textures the modern artisanal bakers try to recreate. Meanwhile, while you're contemplating your daily bread, let me introduce you to the concept of seasonal eating, taken to its logical extreme. Spring means fresh greens and herbs, but also the lean months when preserved food from the previous year is running low and new crops haven't matured yet. Summer brings abundance, but also the pressure to preserve as much as possible for the coming winter. Your protein sources depend on what you can raise, catch, or acquire. Chickens provide both eggs and occasional meat, but you don't eat the productive hens unless you're desperate. They're more valuable alive than dead. Pigs are excellent protein converters, turning scraps and forage into meat that can be preserved through smoking and salting. Dairy products provide crucial nutrition, assuming your cow stays healthy and continues producing. Sound familiar? It should, because anyone who's ever tried to maintain a household budget will recognize the fundamental challenge of maximizing resources while minimizing waste. The difference is that when you miscalculate your food budget, you don't just eat rice and beans for a week. You might genuinely starve. Of course, let's talk about food safety, or rather the complete absence of anything resembling modern food safety standards. Meat preservation involves salt and smoke and hoping for the best. Dairy products are consumed fresh when available and turned into cheese or butter when preservation is necessary. Vegetables are eaten fresh in season and dried, pickled, or stored in root cellars for winter consumption. And yet, somehow, people manage to feed themselves without refrigeration, without preservatives, without global supply chains, and without any understanding of bacteria, vitamins, or nutritional science. The traditional knowledge accumulated over centuries of trial and error created food preservation techniques that were remarkably effective, even if they occasionally resulted in food poisoning that would make modern health inspectors faint. Still, let's address the elephant in the room. Healthcare in Tudor England was a fascinating combination of practical folk wisdom, religious faith, herbal medicine, and pure luck, seasoned with just enough actual medical knowledge to be occasionally helpful. Your local healer might be a wise woman who understands herbal remedies, a barber surgeon who can set bones and remove arrows, or a traveling physician with actual medical training, assuming you can afford their services. Most healthcare happens at the family and community level, using remedies passed down through generations of people who figured out what worked through experience rather than through controlled studies. Willow bark tea for pain, honey for wounds, various herbal preparations for digestive problems, and prayer for everything else constituted the standard medical arsenal available to people at your social level. By modern standards, the mortality rates would be horrifying. But remember that people understood life differently when death was a constant possibility rather than a distant abstraction. Families were larger, partly because infant and child mortality was high. Communities developed strong support systems because individual families couldn't handle medical crises alone. Religious faith provided comfort and meaning in the face of suffering that couldn't be prevented or cured. If you thought modern healthcare was expensive, think again. Medical care in Tudor times was either free because it came from family and community knowledge, or completely unaffordable because trained physicians served only the wealthy. There was no middle ground, no health insurance, and no emergency room where you could receive treatment regardless of your ability to pay. That's right. A simple infection that modern antibiotics could cure in days might kill you, but a broken bone set properly by someone with experience might heal better than many modern medical interventions. Childbirth was dangerous enough that women made wills before going into labor. that midwives were skilled professionals who understood pregnancy and delivery better than many modern practitioners. To be fair, some aspects of Tudor health practices were actually superior to modern approaches. The emphasis on herbal medicine meant that people consumed a much wider variety of plant compounds with genuine therapeutic properties. The physical demands of daily life meant that most people who survived to adulthood were remarkably fit and strong. The absence of processed foods and industrial pollutants meant that many modern health problems simply didn't exist. Meanwhile, personal hygiene was a complex topic that historians have often misunderstood. People weren't as dirty as popular stereotypes suggest. They simply had different cleanliness standards and different available resources. Bathing happened less frequently than modern standards require, but people washed regularly using available water and soap-like substances made from ash and animal fats. Let's be clear about something that modern secular society has trouble understanding. In Tudor England, religion wasn't a private belief system you practiced on weekends. It was the fundamental framework that explained everything. From why crops failed to why children died to why the king had the right to tell everyone what to do. Your entire understanding of reality, morality, and your place in the universe was shaped by Christian doctrine in ways that would make modern believers look casual by comparison. Your religious obligations weren't suggestions or lifestyle choices. They were legal requirements enforced by both church and secular authorities. Attending church services wasn't just spiritually important. It was socially mandatory and legally required. Missing church without a very good reason marked you as potentially dangerous to the community, possibly heretical, and definitely suspicious. The church service itself would be conducted in Latin, which you probably don't understand, by a priest, who might or might not be particularly well-educated or spiritually inspiring. To be fair, the ritual and ceremony weren't designed for individual understanding or personal inspiration. They were designed to connect the entire community to cosmic forces beyond human comprehension, and the mystery was part of the point. Meanwhile, while you're sitting through services conducted in a foreign language, you're participating in a community ritual that connects your tiny village to the largest, most powerful, most sophisticated organization in the known world. The Catholic Church, and later, depending on when exactly you've landed in Tudor history, the Church of England provided the only system of universal education, international communication, and shared cultural identity available to ordinary people. Your local church isn't just a place of worship. It's the community center, the meeting hall, the educational institution, and the social services agency all rolled into one. Church records document births, marriages, and deaths. Church authorities settle disputes that secular courts can't handle. Church festivals provide the primary entertainment and social interaction for the entire community. Sound familiar? It should, because anyone who's ever lived in a small community where one institution dominates social life will recognize the dynamics at play. The difference is that modern people can choose to participate or not, while your participation in church life was as mandatory as paying taxes and considerably more socially regulated. Of course, religion in Tudor England was undergoing dramatic changes that affected everyone from the king to the poorest peasant. The Protestant Reformation wasn't just a theological debate among scholars. It was a political revolution that changed how people understood authority, salvation, and their relationship to God. Depending on when exactly you've awakened in this period, you might find yourself caught up in religious changes that could literally get you killed if you choose the wrong side. And yet, most ordinary people navigated these religious upheavals with the same practical wisdom they applied to other survival challenges. They adapted to new requirements, learned new prayers, adjusted to new ceremonies, and generally tried to avoid taking positions that might attract dangerous attention from authorities. Personal religious conviction was a luxury that most people couldn't afford when religious conformity was enforced by people with swords. Still, don't assume that religious faith was merely political conformity or social obligation. For people living with constant uncertainty, physical hardship, and limited understanding of natural phenomena, religious belief provided genuine comfort, meaningful explanations, and practical guidance for navigating complex moral decisions. By the standards of modern scientific understanding, Tudor people lived in a world filled with supernatural forces, miraculous interventions, and cosmic significance that extended to the smallest details of daily life. Every event had meaning, every hardship had purpose, and every success was evidence of divine favor that must be acknowledged and appreciated. If you thought modern life was stressful, think again. Tudor people lived with the constant awareness that their eternal souls were at stake in every moral decision, that divine judgment was always imminent, and that their individual actions could affect not just their own fate, but the fate of their entire community. The psychological pressure of living with such cosmic significance would be overwhelming by modern standards. That's right, you couldn't just live your life and let others worry about the big questions. Your personal moral conduct, your community participation, your religious observance, and your social behavior were all connected to larger spiritual realities that affected everyone around you. The concept of private morality or individual religious freedom was not just unavailable, it was literally unthinkable. To be fair, this religious framework also provided remarkable psychological resources for dealing with suffering and uncertainty. When bad things happened, and bad things happened regularly, people had explanations that helped them maintain hope and find meaning in their experiences. Religious ritual provided comfort during grief, guidance during difficult decisions, and community support during crises. Meanwhile, the line between religion and what we'd call superstition was much blurrier than modern people generally recognize. Folk practices, herbal medicine, seasonal celebrations, and community rituals combined Christian doctrine with much older traditions that connected people to their natural environment and cultural heritage. Your worldview would include beliefs about lucky and unlucky days, the spiritual significance of natural phenomena, the power of certain words and rituals to influence events, and the presence of supernatural forces that could be influenced through proper behavior and appropriate offerings. This wasn't ignorance or primitive thinking. It was a sophisticated system for managing uncertainty in a world where so much was genuinely beyond human control. Let's be honest about something that might surprise people who think of medieval life as uniformly grim. Tudor peasants knew how to party when circumstances allowed, and their celebrations were more elaborate, more meaningful, and more genuinely fun than most modern entertainment. The key difference is that their festivals weren't scheduled for convenience. They were timed to coincide with natural cycles, religious observances, and brief respites from the constant demands of survival. Your social calendar is governed entirely by the agricultural year and the church calendar, which means that celebration and hardship alternate in patterns that connect your personal life to cosmic rhythms most modern people have completely lost touch with. Spring festivals celebrate renewal and hope after surviving another winter. Summer festivals mark the abundance that makes survival possible. Harvest festivals express gratitude for successful crops. Winter festivals provide light and warmth during the darkest months. Meanwhile, while you're learning to appreciate entertainment that doesn't involve electricity or professional performers, remember that Tudor festivals were community productions where everyone participated. There were no passive audiences, no tickets to purchase, and no professional entertainment industry to provide distraction from daily concerns. Instead, every festival was a collaborative effort that strengthened social bonds while providing psychological relief from constant work. May Day celebrations involved the entire community in elaborate rituals that combined ancient pagan traditions with Christian symbolism, creating a unique cultural synthesis that acknowledged both natural cycles and religious doctrine. The maypole dancing, flower gathering, and general merriment served multiple purposes. They marked seasonal transitions, strengthened community bonds, provided opportunities for courtship, and offered psychological release from winter's constraints. To be fair, these celebrations weren't just frivolous entertainment. They were essential social institutions that helped maintain community cohesion during difficult times. When people live in such close quarters under such challenging circumstances, they need structured opportunities to resolve tensions, express creativity, and reaffirm their commitment to mutual support. Harvest festivals were particularly significant because they celebrated the successful completion of the year's most important work while providing thanksgiving for survival that wasn't guaranteed. The community feast wasn't just a party. It was a sacred ritual that acknowledged divine providence, honored successful cooperation, and distributed surplus food to ensure that everyone shared in the abundance that made winter survival possible. Sound familiar? It should, because anyone who's ever experienced the satisfaction of completing a major project with a team of dedicated colleagues will recognize the emotional dynamics at play. The difference is that your project completion literally determined whether your family would live or die, which tends to make the celebration more intense. Of course, let's talk about Christmas, which in Tudor times was a much more elaborate and socially significant celebration than the modern holiday. Christmas wasn't just one day. It was a 12-day festival that provided the primary break from agricultural work, the main opportunity for extended socializing, and the most important religious observance of the year. And yet, Christmas celebrations had to be carefully balanced against the reality that winter was the season when resources were scarcest. Heating was most expensive and survival was most precarious. Celebration had to be genuine enough to provide psychological benefits while being modest enough not to waste resources that might be needed for survival. Still, don't underestimate the creativity that people applied to making the most of limited resources. Christmas entertainments included elaborate storytelling, complex songs and dances, dramatic performances, games that required skill and wit rather than expensive equipment, and feasting that transformed simple ingredients into memorable experiences. Through communal preparation and shared appreciation. By modern standards, the entertainment would seem primitive, but remember the people who created their own fun developed skills and social connections that passive entertainment consumption simply can't provide. Everyone could sing, everyone could dance, everyone could tell stories, and everyone could contribute to community celebrations in ways that made them active participants rather than passive consumers. If you thought modern social media created community connections, think again. Tudor festivals created face-to-face interactions, shared physical experiences, and cooperative accomplishments that bonded people together in ways that virtual interactions simply can't match. The shared memory of successful celebrations became part of the community's cultural heritage, referenced and celebrated for years afterward. That's right, entertainment wasn't something you purchased or consumed. It was something you created collaboratively with your neighbors, using traditional forms that had been refined over generations of community practice. The songs, dances, games, and stories weren't just entertainment. They were cultural technologies for maintaining social cohesion, transmitting important information, and providing psychological resources for dealing with hardship. To be fair, not every day included festivals, and the vast majority of your time would be spent working rather than celebrating. But the anticipation of upcoming festivals provided psychological sustenance during difficult periods, and the memory of past celebrations provided evidence that life included joy as well as hardship. Meanwhile, Smaller celebrations happened throughout the year to mark personal milestones, seasonal transitions, and religious observances. Weddings were community festivals that celebrated new family formations, while providing opportunities for extended socializing. Baptisms marked new community members while reaffirming religious commitments. Even funerals included celebratory elements that honored the deceased while strengthening bonds. Among survivors thought your personal entertainment would also include activities that combined practical skills with social interaction. Evening gatherings might involve storytelling, riddle contests, or musical performances while people worked on tasks like spinning, weaving, or tool maintenance. Work songs made repetitive tasks more bearable while coordinating group efforts. Competitive games developed skills that were useful in practical contexts while providing opportunities for friendly rivalry. Let's be clear about your political influence. In Tudor England, you have approximately the same impact on royal policy as a grain of wheat has on the operation of a mill. You're essential to the process, but nobody asks your opinion about how things should be run. Still, the decisions made in royal courts and noble estates affect your daily life in ways that modern people, accustomed to democratic representation and individual rights, would find both fascinating and terrifying. Your relationship to political power is mediated through layers of authority that stretch from your immediate landlord up through increasingly distant figures until they reach the king himself, who exists in a realm so far removed from your experience that he might as well be a mythological figure. To be fair, this distance does provide a certain protection. Most political upheavals happen far above your social level, allowing you to continue farming while nobles fight over who gets to tax your grain. Meanwhile, while courtiers are plotting against each other in palaces you'll never see, your most direct political experience comes through local administration. The sheriff's men might appear periodically to collect taxes, conscript soldiers, or investigate crimes that threaten royal authority. These interactions aren't pleasant social visits. They're reminders that however isolated your village might seem, you're still part of a larger system that can make demands you cannot refuse. Wars, which happen regularly throughout the Tudor period, affect you in ways that demonstrate just how little control ordinary people have over their own destinies. When the king decides to invade France, conquer Scotland, or suppress a rebellion, your contribution might include higher taxes to fund military campaigns, conscription of your sons or neighbors for military service, or increased demand for agricultural products to feed armies you'll never see. Sound familiar? It should, because anyone who's ever watched their tax dollars fund government programs they don't support, or seen their community's young people recruited for conflicts they don't understand, will recognize the fundamental powerlessness that ordinary people experience when political decisions are made without their input. Of course, wars aren't just distant events that affect your tax burden. They're immediate threats that can destroy everything you've worked to build. When armies march through your region, they need food, shelter, and supplies, and they're not particularly concerned about whether you can spare what they take. Soldiers from both sides of any conflict are equally dangerous to civilian populations who have no military protection and no political influence. And yet, somehow, communities develop strategies for surviving political upheavals that had nothing to do with their desires or interests. Villages learn to hide resources, disperse valuable items, and present an appearance of poverty that might discourage systematic looting. Families develop networks that could provide temporary refuge when violence made staying home too dangerous. Still, don't assume that political events always worked against peasant interests. Sometimes, political changes created opportunities for ordinary people to improve their circumstances. The dissolution of monasteries under Henry VIII, for example, released large amounts of land onto the market, which occasionally allowed successful farmers to acquire property that had previously been unavailable. By the same token, political instability could disrupt the social arrangements that kept people trapped in poverty. When nobles were fighting each other instead of managing their estates, traditional obligations might be overlooked or forgotten. When royal authority was weak, local communities might gain practical autonomy that allowed them to organize their affairs according to their own interests rather than external demands. If you thought modern politics were divisive, think again. Tudor religious conflicts literally split families, destroyed communities, and created life-or-death loyalty tests that force people to choose between their personal beliefs and their physical safety. The religious changes that accompanied the English Reformation weren't academic debates. They were political revolutions that required everyone to demonstrate their allegiance to new authorities or face consequences ranging from social ostracism to execution. That's right, your religious opinions, which modern people consider matters of private conscience, were political positions that could determine whether you lived or died. Converting from Catholicism to Protestantism, or vice versa, depending on which monarch was currently in power, wasn't just spiritual transformation. It was political survival strategy that affected your entire family's future prospects. To be fair, most ordinary people navigated these religious and political changes with the same practical wisdom they applied to other survival challenges. They learned which opinions were safe to express, which ceremonies were required, and which authorities needed to be acknowledged, while maintaining whatever private beliefs helped them make sense of their experiences. Meanwhile, the broader political world operated according to principles that would be familiar to anyone who's ever worked in a large organization where decisions are made by people who don't understand the practical implications of their policies. Information moved slowly up the chain of command, often becoming distorted or oversimplified in the process. Decisions were made based on incomplete information by people who had never experienced the conditions their policies would create. Your local representatives, the people who actually implemented royal policies in your community, were caught between competing demands from above and below. They needed to satisfy royal officials who expected compliance with directives that might be completely impractical, while also maintaining relationships with local communities, whose cooperation was essential for any policy to actually work. The result was a political system that was both remarkably stable and constantly evolving, as local communities found ways to adapt royal policies to their specific circumstances while maintaining the appearance of compliance that satisfied distant authorities. This creative interpretation of official requirements became an art form that allowed communities to survive political changes that might otherwise have destroyed them. Of course, this system also meant that justice and law enforcement were highly variable, depending on local circumstances and personal relationships. The same crime might be punished severely in one village and ignored completely in another, depending on who was involved, who had influence, and how local authorities chose to interpret royal law. Let's be honest about something that might make modern dating apps seem like paradise. In Tudor England, your romantic life was about as private as a town square announcement, and your marriage prospects were determined by a complex calculation involving family finances, social status, available land, and the urgent need to create economic partnerships that could survive the next plague outbreak. If you thought modern relationships were complicated, wait until you discover a system where love was considered a pleasant bonus rather than a prerequisite for matrimony. Your approach to finding a spouse begins with the understanding that marriage isn't primarily about personal fulfillment or romantic compatibility. It's an economic merger that affects not just you and your partner, but both of your extended families, your village community, and your long-term survival prospects. To be fair, this practical approach to marriage often created partnerships that were more stable and mutually supportive than modern romantic marriages. even if they lacked the emotional intensity that contemporary culture considers essential. The process of courtship, such as it exists, happens under the watchful eyes of parents, neighbors, and community members who have strong opinions about suitable matches and aren't shy about expressing them. Your potential spouse needs to bring economic assets to the partnership, land, livestock, skills, or family connections that improve your collective prospects for survival and prosperity. Meanwhile, while you're navigating the complex social negotiations that constitute Tudor courtship, remember that gender roles are so rigidly defined that they make traditional marriage stereotypes look progressive. Men are expected to handle fieldwork, livestock management, financial negotiations, and representing the family in community affairs. Women are responsible for food preparation, textile production, child rearing, herb gardening, and managing the complex domestic economy that keeps households functioning. Sound familiar? It should, because anyone who's ever divided household responsibilities with a partner will recognize the fundamental challenge of coordinating different skills and priorities to accomplish shared goals. The difference is that Tudor couples couldn't afford to argue about who does what. Survival depended on both partners fulfilling their traditional roles with maximum efficiency and minimum conflict. Of course, let's talk about the wedding itself, which was less about celebrating romantic love and more about publicly establishing a new economic unit, while ensuring community witness to the legal and religious obligations being undertaken. Your wedding celebration reflects your family's economic status and social connections. But more importantly, it marks your transition from being your parents' economic dependent to being part of an independent household unit. And yet, don't assume that Tudor marriages were uniformly loveless business arrangements. Many couples developed deep affection and mutual respect over years of shared hardship and cooperation. The difference is that love was expected to grow from shared experience and mutual dependence rather than being the foundation upon which the relationship was built. Still, marriage in Tudor England comes with responsibilities and constraints that would seem overwhelming by modern standards. Your spouse isn't just your romantic partner. They're your business partner, your insurance policy, your primary source of emotional support, and your retirement plan all rolled into one person. The success of your marriage determines not just your personal happiness, but your family's economic survival and social standing. By modern standards, the lack of individual autonomy within marriage would seem intolerable. But remember that individual autonomy was a luxury that most people couldn't afford when survival required constant cooperation and mutual dependence. Successful Tudor marriages were built on complementary skills, shared responsibilities, and the understanding that personal preferences were less important than collective success. If you thought modern parenting was demanding, think again. Tudor child rearing begins with the sobering reality that roughly half of all children don't survive to adulthood, which means that every pregnancy is both a source of hope and a potential source of devastating grief. Parents invest enormous emotional energy in their children, while simultaneously maintaining psychological distance as protection against the loss that's statistically likely. That's right, Tudor parents face the impossible challenge of providing loving care while preparing themselves for the possibility that their investment in time, emotion, and resources might be lost to disease, accident, or malnutrition that they're powerless to prevent. This creates parenting strategies that emphasize practical skills, social conformity, and religious preparation, rather than individual self-expression or personal fulfillment. To be fair, the children who survive Tudor childhoods often develop remarkable resilience, practical skills, and community connections that serve them well throughout their lives. The harsh realities of medieval life create strong people who understand cooperation, accept hardship, and find joy in simple pleasures that modern children might overlook entirely. Meanwhile, child labor isn't considered exploitation, it's considered education. Children begin contributing to household and community work as soon as they're physically capable, learning skills that will be essential for their own survival and economic success. The modern concept of childhood as a protected period of play and learning would be incomprehensible to people whose children's survival depends on their early mastery of practical skills. Your role as a parent involves teaching your children not just practical skills, but social expectations, religious obligations, and community values that will allow them to function successfully within the rigid social structure that governs Tudor life. This isn't just moral education, it's survival. Training that could literally determine whether your children live or die. Of course, gender differences in child rearing reflect the broader social expectations that will govern your children's adult lives. Boys learn agricultural skills, animal management, and basic crafts that will allow them to support families of their own. Girls learn domestic skills, textile production, and food preservation techniques that will make them valuable marriage partners and capable household managers. And yet, both boys and girls receive education that modern children rarely get: direct instruction in community cooperation, conflict resolution, resource management, and the complex social skills necessary for maintaining relationships with people you can't avoid or replace. These social skills often prove more valuable than technical knowledge when survival depends on community support. Still, don't romanticize Tudor family life too much. The physical demands of daily survival left little time for the kind of emotional intimacy and individual attention that modern families consider essential. Parents were often too exhausted from work and too stressed about survival to provide the kind of nurturing support that contemporary parenting experts recommend. Let's be clear about something that might shock people accustomed to modern legal systems. Justice in Tudor England was a fascinating combination of community consensus, traditional precedent, religious authority, and occasionally spectacular public punishment that served as both deterrent and entertainment. Your local justice system operates on principles that would make modern civil rights lawyers weep, but it somehow manages to maintain social order in communities where formal law enforcement barely exists. Your first encounter with Tudor justice probably involves the manor court, where your landlord or his representative settles disputes between tenants, enforces agricultural regulations, and handles minor crimes that don't warrant attention from higher authorities. This isn't a court of law in the modern sense. It's more like a community meeting where traditional authority figures make decisions based on local customs and practical considerations. To be fair, this informal approach to justice often produces results that are more practical and community-oriented than modern legal systems can achieve. When your neighbor's cow repeatedly breaks into your garden, the manor court can order immediate compensation and future prevention measures that actually solve the problem rather than just establishing legal precedent. Meanwhile, while you're learning to navigate local dispute resolution, remember that serious crimes, theft, assault, murder, and anything that threatens royal authority are handled by justices of the peace, who represent royal authority at the county level. These officials have broad discretionary power to investigate crimes, arrest suspects, and impose punishments that range from fines and public humiliation to execution. The investigation process would be recognizable to anyone who's ever lived in a small community where everyone knows everyone else's business. Evidence consists primarily of witness testimony, community reputation, and circumstantial evidence that establishes opportunity and motive. The concept of physical evidence or forensic investigation belongs to a much later period of legal development. Sound familiar? It should. Because anyone who's ever been involved in workplace disputes or community conflicts will recognize the fundamental challenge of determining truth. When different people have different versions of events and different interests in the outcome, the difference is that Tudor legal proceedings could result in punishments that modern people would consider barbaric. Of course, let's talk about punishment, which serves multiple purposes beyond just deterring crime. Public punishment demonstrates royal authority, reinforces social hierarchies, provides entertainment for communities that have few other diversions, and creates shared experiences that bind communities together through collective witness to justice being administered. And yet most Tudor punishments are designed to be restorative rather than purely punitive. Fines compensate victims for losses. Public humiliation restores community moral standards, and even physical punishment is often calibrated to match the severity of the crime while allowing the offender to return to community life afterward. Still, serious crimes receive serious punishments that reflect both the practical needs of deterrence and the religious understanding that crime violates divine as well as human law. Theft of property worth more than 12 pence is a hanging offense, not because Tudor people are particularly bloodthirsty, but because theft threatens the survival of families who have no margin for loss. By modern standards, the death penalty for property crimes seems excessive. But remember that in a subsistence economy, stealing someone's livestock or grain reserves could literally cause their family to starve. The severity of punishment reflects the severity of consequences that crime creates in communities where people live so close to the survival margin. If you thought modern criminal justice moved slowly, think again. Tudor justice is swift, public, and final. Once a crime has been investigated and a suspect identified, the legal process moves quickly to resolution. There are no prolonged appeals processes, no complex procedural safeguards, and no presumption of innocence that requires extensive proof of guilt. That's right. The burden of proof in Tudor legal proceedings falls on the accused to demonstrate their innocence rather than on authorities to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. This approach reflects both the practical limitations of investigation techniques and the social assumption that community suspicion probably has some basis in reality. To be fair, this system does include some safeguards that protect people from arbitrary punishment. Serious accusations require multiple witnesses. Community reputation matters in determining credibility. And traditional penalties provide predictable consequences that can't be imposed arbitrarily by individual officials. Meanwhile, many disputes never reach formal legal proceedings because communities develop their own mechanisms for maintaining order and resolving conflicts. Village social pressure, economic sanctions, and the threat of exclusion from community support often prove more effective than formal punishment in modifying behavior and maintaining social harmony. Your experience with Tudor justice demonstrates something that modern legal systems often overlook. Most crime prevention happens through social relationships rather than through formal law enforcement. When everyone knows everyone else, when community support is essential for survival, and when reputation affects economic opportunities, people have strong incentives to maintain good relationships with their neighbors. Of course, this social approach to crime prevention also means that communities can become oppressive environments where conformity is enforced through constant surveillance and social pressure. Individual privacy and personal autonomy are sacrificed to maintain collective security and social harmony. And yet, the alternative, formal law enforcement that relies on professional police and complex legal procedures simply doesn't exist at your social level. Communities that want safety and order must create their own systems for maintaining both, using whatever social resources and traditional authorities are available. Still, don't assume that Tudor justice is always harsh or arbitrary. Many crimes are handled through restitution, community service, or symbolic punishment that restores social harmony without permanently damaging the offender's prospects for rehabilitation. The goal is often to reintegrate offenders into community life rather than to exclude them permanently. Let's be honest about something that would make modern economists weep. Your Tudor economy operates primarily on barter, reciprocal obligation, and seasonal surpluses that must be carefully managed to ensure survival through periods when nothing grows and everything costs more than you can afford. The money economy exists, but it touches your life about as frequently as visits from the royal court, which is to say almost never, and usually as a sign that something has gone terribly wrong. Your primary economic relationships are with your immediate neighbors, your landlord, and the rotating cast of traveling merchants, craftsmen, and seasonal laborers who appear in your village according to patterns that have been established over centuries of trial and error. To be fair, this local economy is remarkably sophisticated in its ability to coordinate complex exchanges without central planning or standardized currency. The foundation of your economic life is agricultural surplus, the portion of your harvest that exceeds your family's immediate survival needs. This surplus becomes your currency, your insurance policy, your investment capital, and your ticket to participating in the broader economic relationships that make specialized goods and services available at the village level. Meanwhile, while you're learning to think of grain as money and livestock as investment portfolios, remember that your economic decisions have consequences that extend far beyond personal financial planning. Your choice to plant barley instead of wheat affects not just your family's diet, but the village's collective food security, brewing capacity, and trading relationships with neighboring communities. Your relationship with traveling merchants provides access to goods that can't be produced locally, salt for food preservation, iron for tools, luxury items that demonstrate social status, and specialized products that improve your quality of life when you can afford them. These merchant relationships operate on credit systems that depend on trust, reputation, and community guarantee, rather than on formal contracts or legal enforcement. Sound familiar? It should, because anyone who's ever participated in local farmers markets, community-supported agriculture, or neighborhood exchange networks will recognize the fundamental principles at work. The difference is that Tudor people depended on these local economic relationships for survival, rather than using them to supplement global supply chains. Of course, let's talk about market days, which transform your sleepy village into a bustling commercial center where farmers, craftsmen, and merchants gather to exchange goods, share information, and negotiate the complex trades to keep the local economy functioning. Market day isn't just commerce, it's social networking, news distribution, and community celebration all wrapped into one essential institution. And yet, market participation requires skills that go far beyond simple buying and selling. You need to assess quality, negotiate prices, evaluate the creditworthiness of trading partners, and coordinate timing so that you're selling when prices are high and buying when they're low. These skills develop through years of experience and community mentorship rather than through formal education. Still, don't assume that Tudor markets are primitive versions of modern commercial exchanges. The quality standards, pricing mechanisms, and trading relationships that emerge from community-based commerce often produce better outcomes for both buyers and sellers than impersonal market transactions that prioritize efficiency over relationship. Maintenance. By modern standards, the lack of standardized prices, quality guarantees, and legal remedies for commercial disputes would seem impossibly risky. But remember that Tudor commercial relationships are embedded in social relationships that provide enforcement mechanisms more reliable than legal contracts. Cheating customers or suppliers means damaging relationships that are essential for long-term survival and prosperity. If you thought modern supply chains were complex, Think again. Tudor communities create remarkably sophisticated networks for moving goods, sharing information, and coordinating production across wide geographical areas, all without telecommunications, standardized transportation, or centralized management. The system works through personal relationships, traditional arrangements, and collective problem-solving that would impress modern logistics experts. That's right. Your village participates in trade, networks that stretch across England and into continental Europe, connecting your local agricultural production to urban markets, international commerce, and global economic forces that you'll never directly encounter but that influence prices, demand, and availability of everything from salt to silk. To be fair, this integration into broader economic systems also means that your local community is vulnerable to disruptions that originate far beyond your control or understanding. Bad harvests in distant regions can affect prices for goods you need. Political conflicts between kingdoms can disrupt trade routes that bring essential supplies to your area. Currency devaluations by royal decree can destroy the value of any money you've managed to accumulate. Meanwhile, your participation in the Tudor economy requires skills that modern people rarely develop. The ability to assess quality by touch, smell, and appearance. The social intelligence to negotiate mutually beneficial exchanges. The mathematical skills to calculate complex trades involving multiple goods and services. And the risk management skills to balance current needs against future uncertainties. Your economic planning operates on multiple time horizons simultaneously. Daily decisions about resource allocation must consider seasonal variations in supply and demand. Seasonal decisions about planting and harvesting must consider annual patterns in weather and market conditions. Annual decisions about livestock and equipment must consider the decade-long cycles that determine when major investments pay off or create unsustainable debt burdens. Of course, the most important aspect of Tudor economics is something that modern market systems largely ignore: the relationship between economic activity and community social fabric. Your economic decisions affect not just your family's financial situation, but your standing in the community, your access to social support during emergencies, and your children's prospects for successful integration into local economic networks. And yet, this social dimension of economic life creates both opportunities and constraints that don't exist in impersonal market systems. Successful economic relationships require social skills, community standing, and reputation maintenance that can be more demanding than technical competence or financial resources. Still, remember that your Tudor economic experience demonstrates something that modern economists often overlook. Successful economies depend on social trust, community cooperation, and shared commitment to mutual prosperity, rather than just on individual profit maximization and market efficiency. The Tudor system works because everyone understands that their individual success depends on collective prosperity. Let's be clear about something that might surprise people who think of medieval England as uniformly primitive: the regional variations. In Tudor, life were so dramatic that moving from one county to another could feel like traveling to a completely different country, with different languages, different customs, different economic systems, and different assumptions about everything, from proper behavior to religious practice. If you thought modern regional differences were significant, you're about to discover what genuine cultural diversity looks like when communities develop in relative isolation over centuries. Your specific location within Tudor England determines not just your dialect and local customs, but your entire worldview, economic opportunities, social structure, and daily survival strategies. A farmer in Yorkshire faces completely different challenges than a farmer in Devon, not just because of different climates and soil conditions, but because of different cultural traditions, different relationships with authority, and different Approaches to community organization. To be fair, these regional differences developed for practical reasons that made perfect sense given local conditions. Communities in mountainous regions develop different agricultural techniques, social arrangements, and cultural values than communities in fertile river valleys. Coastal communities created different economic relationships and social structures than inland communities. Areas with good transportation connections evolve differently than isolated regions. Meanwhile, while you're discovering that Tudor England is actually a collection of dozens of distinct regional cultures, remember that these differences affect every aspect of your daily life. The crops you can grow, the building materials available for your house, the local foods that define your diet, and the seasonal rhythms that structure your year all vary dramatically depending on where exactly you've awakened in this Tudor fantasy. Your local dialect might be so different from the English spoken in other regions that communication with visitors requires careful attention and frequent clarification. Regional vocabulary, pronunciation patterns, and grammatical structures create linguistic barriers that would challenge modern people accustomed to standardized national languages and mass media communication. Sound familiar? It should, because anyone who's ever moved from one region to another and discovered that local customs, social expectations, and communication styles differ significantly from their previous experience will recognize the challenges of cultural adaptation. The difference is that Tudor regional differences were much more pronounced and much more difficult to bridge. Of course, let's talk about local traditions that govern everything from courtship, rituals to agricultural practices to religious observances. Your community's approach to celebrating seasonal festivals, organizing communal work projects, resolving disputes, and maintaining social hierarchies reflects centuries of local adaptation to specific conditions and challenges. And yet, these local traditions aren't just quaint customs that add color to community life. They're sophisticated technologies for managing social relationships, coordinating economic activity, and maintaining cultural continuity under challenging conditions. What might seem like arbitrary rules or meaningless ceremonies to outsiders often serve essential functions for maintaining community cohesion and collective survival. Still, regional differences in Tudor England also create opportunities for economic specialization and cultural exchange that benefit everyone involved. Communities that excel at producing particular goods or developing specific skills can trade their surpluses for products and services they can't produce as efficiently themselves. By the same token, regional variations in social customs, religious practices, and cultural values create a rich tapestry of human experience that demonstrates the remarkable creativity humans display when adapting to different environments and challenges. The diversity of solutions that different communities develop for similar problems provides a fascinating study in human ingenuity and cultural evolution. If you thought modern globalization created cultural homogenization, think again. Tudor England's regional diversity demonstrates what happens when communities develop their own solutions to common challenges without constant external influence or pressure to conform to standardized practices. The result is a level of cultural creativity and local adaptation that modern, standardized systems rarely achieve. That's right. Your particular Tudor community has developed its own unique approach to everything from house construction to marriage customs to religious practice. Based on centuries of experimentation, local conditions, and cultural inheritance that creates a way of life specifically adapted to your environmental and social circumstances. To be fair, this regional diversity also creates challenges for anyone who needs to travel, conduct business with distant communities, or navigate social situations outside their home region. The customs that seem natural and obvious in your home community might be incomprehensible or offensive in other regions, creating potential for misunderstanding and conflict. Meanwhile, the lack of standardized practices means that knowledge and innovations develop unevenly across different regions. A technological improvement, agricultural technique, or social innovation that dramatically improves life in one area might never spread to other regions that could benefit from similar changes. Your regional identity isn't just about local customs and cultural practices. It's about economic relationships, political loyalties, and social networks that connect your community to broader regional systems while maintaining distinctive local characteristics. These connections provide both opportunities and constraints that shape your possibilities for social mobility, economic advancement, and cultural participation. Of course, regional differences in Tudor England also reflect different relationships with central authority, different historical experiences of conflict and cooperation, and different degrees of integration into broader political and economic systems. Some regions maintain relatively autonomous local governance, while others are more directly controlled by central authorities. Let's be honest about something that would horrify modern child development experts. Tudor childhood is less a protected period of innocent play and gradual learning than it is an intensive apprenticeship in survival skills, social conformity, and practical wisdom that begins almost from birth and accelerates rapidly as soon as children can walk, talk, and follow simple instructions. If you thought modern children were overscheduled, wait until you meet Tudor kids who are expected to contribute meaningfully to household survival before they're old enough for elementary school. Your Tudor childhood experience, or more relevantly, your children's childhood experience, begins with the sobering reality that roughly half of all babies don't survive their first year, which means that every milestone represents not just development but triumph over odds that would make modern parents seek therapy. To be fair, the children who survive this gauntlet of early mortality often develop remarkable resilience and practical competence that serves them well throughout their lives. The concept of formal education, as we understand it, simply doesn't exist for children at your social level. Instead, education happens through direct participation in adult work, careful observation of skilled practitioners, and gradual assumption of real responsibilities that have genuine consequences for family, survival, and community prosperity. Meanwhile, while modern parents worry about screen time and academic achievement, Tudor parents focus on teaching children skills that will literally determine whether they live or die as adults. Agricultural techniques, animal husbandry, food preservation, textile production, basic carpentry, herb identification, weather prediction, and the complex social skills necessary for maintaining community relationships. Your children's education begins as soon as they can walk safely, with simple tasks like feeding chickens, gathering eggs, picking vegetables, and carrying messages between adults. These aren't just busy work designed to keep children occupied. They're genuine contributions to household economy that free adults from more complex and dangerous tasks. Sound familiar? It should, because anyone who's ever worked in family, businesses, or participated in multi-generational households will recognize the advantages of learning through real participation rather than through artificial educational exercises. The difference is that Tudor children are participating in activities where mistakes have immediate and sometimes serious consequences. Of course, let's talk about play, which does exist in Tudor childhood, but serves different purposes than modern recreational activities. Children's games often involve practicing adult skills in low-stakes contexts, mock battles that teach combat techniques, dollhouse scenarios that practice household management, simple crafts that develop fine motor skills needed for adult work. And yet, Tudor children do experience genuine childhood pleasures that modern kids might envy. Unlimited outdoor time, close relationships with animals, seasonal adventures that change throughout the year, community celebrations that include everyone regardless of age, and the satisfaction of mastering skills that have obvious practical value. Still, don't romanticize Tudor childhood too much. The physical demands are intense, the emotional support is limited, and the margin for error is small. Children who can't adapt quickly to adult expectations face genuine hardship that could affect their entire future prospects by modern standards. Tudor children grow up remarkably fast, assuming adult responsibilities and making important decisions at ages when contemporary kids are still learning to tie their shoes. A 12-year-old Tudor child might be managing livestock, planning crop rotations, or negotiating trade relationships with neighboring families. If you thought modern academic pressure was intense, think again. Tudor children face the pressure of knowing that their mastery of practical skills will determine not just their individual success, but their family's survival and their community's prosperity. There are no do-overs, no safety nets, and no alternative paths if they fail to master essential competencies. That's right, your Tudor children are learning lessons that most modern adults never master. How to read weather patterns, assess animal health, judge soil conditions, preserve food safely, manage seasonal resources, maintain tools and equipment, and navigate complex social relationships where everyone depends on everyone else. To be fair, this intensive childhood education creates adults who are remarkably competent, resourceful, and self-reliant by modern standards. They understand how things work, they can solve practical problems creatively, and they have realistic expectations about what life requires and what rewards it offers. Meanwhile, the absence of formal schooling doesn't mean the absence of intellectual development. Tudor children learn mathematics through practical applications, like measuring fields and calculating harvest yields. They develop language skills through storytelling, songs, and community discussions. They learn history and geography through family stories and seasonal cycles. Your children's moral and religious education happens through constant participation in community life rather than through formal instruction. They learn right from wrong by observing consequences, experiencing community approval and disapproval, and gradually internalizing the values that make community life possible. Of course, childhood friendships in Tudor communities are often lifelong. Relationships that provide both personal support and economic cooperation throughout adult life. The children who play together become the adults who work together, marry each other's siblings, and support each other through decades of shared challenges. And yet, Tudor childhood also includes experiences that modern children rarely encounter: direct contact with birth and death, participation in genuinely dangerous activities, exposure to adult problems and responsibilities, and the constant awareness that survival depends on collective effort rather than individual achievement. Still, remember that Tudor children often report higher levels of life satisfaction and community connection than modern children, who have access to much better material conditions but less meaningful participation in adult society. The trade-offs between safety and significance, comfort and competence, are more complex than simple historical progress narratives suggest. Let's be clear about something that modern death-avoidant culture finds deeply uncomfortable. Death in Tudor England isn't a distant possibility that might happen someday. If medical science fails, it's an immediate presence that shapes every aspect of daily life: family planning, community relationships, and personal psychology, in ways that would fundamentally alter how modern people approach everything from career planning to romantic relationships. Your relationship with mortality begins with the simple statistical reality that life expectancy hovers around 40 years if you're lucky, which means that everyone you know is constantly making decisions based on the assumption that time is limited. Resources are finite, and death could arrive at any moment through disease, accident, violence, or simple misfortune that no amount of preparation can prevent. To be fair, this constant awareness of mortality creates a psychological framework that emphasizes present relationships, immediate community obligations, and spiritual preparation over the long-term planning and individual achievement that characterize modern life approaches. People who expect to die young focus on different priorities than people who expect to live to retirement age. Meanwhile, while you're adjusting to a world where death is a familiar neighbor rather than a distant stranger, remember that Tudor communities have developed sophisticated social and spiritual technologies for managing grief, maintaining continuity, and extracting meaning from loss that would challenge modern therapeutic approaches. Your experience of death begins early and continues throughout life. Childhood mortality means that most parents bury at least one child. Most children lose siblings, and everyone learns early that attachment and loss are inseparable aspects of human experience that must be accepted rather than avoided. Sound familiar? It should, because anyone who's lived through serious illness, military deployment, or dangerous occupations will recognize the psychological adaptations that people make when death is a realistic possibility rather than an abstract concept. The difference is that Tudor people lived with these adaptations constantly rather than temporarily. Of course, let's talk about the dying process itself, which happens at home, surrounded by family and community members who participate actively in preparing the dying person for death and the surviving community for continued life without them. Death isn't medicalized or hidden. It's a community event that everyone witnesses and everyone learns from. And yet, this community approach to death creates both support systems and psychological pressures that modern people rarely experience. Everyone knows how to prepare bodies for burial, comfort grieving families, and maintain social continuity when important community members die. But everyone also lives with the constant awareness that they might be next. Still, Tudor approaches to death and dying include spiritual and psychological resources that many modern people lack. Religious faith provides explanations for suffering and death that help people maintain hope and meaning, even in the face of devastating loss. Community ritual provides structured ways to express grief and affirm continued connection to deceased loved ones. By modern standards, Tudor burial practices would seem primitive and potentially unsanitary. But remember that these practices serve important psychological and social functions that sterile modern procedures often fail to provide. Family and community participation in preparing bodies, conducting funeral rituals, and maintaining grave sites creates ongoing relationships with deceased loved ones that provide comfort and continuity. If you thought modern inheritance law was complex, think again. Tudor inheritance operates according to customary practices that vary by region, family circumstances, and local traditions, creating a system that's both more flexible and more uncertain than modern legal frameworks. The goal isn't just transferring property. It's maintaining family continuity and community stability across generations. That's right. When you die in Tudor England, your property doesn't just transfer to your legal heirs according to standardized procedures. Instead, your community makes decisions about how to distribute your assets in ways that maintain social harmony, support vulnerable survivors, and preserve the economic relationships that keep everyone alive. To be fair, this community-based approach to inheritance often produces more equitable and practical outcomes than formal legal procedures, especially in cases where strict legal inheritance would create hardship for family members who depend on inherited resources for survival. Meanwhile, your preparations for death begin long before you're actually dying. Making arrangements for your children's care, ensuring that your spouse can maintain the household without you, and transferring essential skills and knowledge to younger Community members are ongoing responsibilities rather than last minute. Emergency planning. Your legacy in Tudor England isn't measured primarily by material wealth or individual achievement. It's measured by your contribution to community continuity, family stability, and the transmission of essential knowledge and skills to future generations. Success means leaving your family and community better prepared for survival than they were before you lived among them. Of course, the spiritual dimensions of death preparation involve not just personal religious observance, but community relationships that provide both earthly support and spiritual comfort. Your standing in the community affects not just your living conditions, but your prospects for salvation and your family's social position after your death. And yet, Tudor people often approach death with acceptance and even anticipation that would seem remarkable to modern death-anxious culture. When life is difficult and uncertain, death sometimes represents relief rather than tragedy, especially for people whose physical suffering or social circumstances make continued life more burden than blessing. Still, don't assume that Tudor acceptance of death means indifference to life or casual attitudes toward mortality. Instead, the constant presence of death makes life more precious, relationships more important, and present moments more significant than they seem to people who assume they have unlimited time for future fulfillment. Let's be honest about something that might surprise people who think of Tudor technology as uniformly primitive. The level of innovation, practical problem solving, and mechanical ingenuity displayed by ordinary farmers and craftsmen would impress modern engineers, especially considering they achieved remarkable results using only materials that could be found, grown, or made within walking distance of their villages. If you thought modern makers and DIY enthusiasts were resourceful, wait until you meet Tudor peasants who literally had to invent solutions or die trying. Your technological world operates on principles that would be familiar to anyone who's ever had to repair something with limited tools and materials. Understand how things work. Identify what's actually broken. Use whatever resources are available, and create solutions that are simple enough to maintain but robust enough to last. To be fair, this approach often produces more durable and repairable technology than modern manufactured goods that are designed for replacement rather than repair. The tools you use daily represent centuries of evolutionary development by people who understood exactly what needed to be accomplished and had intimate knowledge of local materials and conditions. Your plow, your scythe, your hammer, and your cooking pots aren't just manufactured objects. They're sophisticated technologies that have been refined through generations of use, modification, and improvement by people whose lives depended on their effectiveness. Meanwhile, while you're discovering that medieval tools are actually remarkably well designed for their intended purposes, remember that most technological innovation happens at the user level rather than through formal research and development. Farmers modify their plows for local soil conditions. Blacksmiths experiment with different metal alloys, and craftsmen develop specialized techniques that solve specific problems more effectively than standard approaches. Your daily experience with technology involves constant maintenance, modification, and repair that would challenge modern people accustomed to disposable manufactured goods. Every tool requires regular care. Every mechanism needs periodic adjustment, and every piece of equipment must be understood well enough to diagnose and fix problems when they inevitably occur. Sound familiar? It should, because anyone who's ever restored vintage cars, maintained old houses, or worked with hand tools will recognize the satisfaction and frustration of technology that requires skill and attention, but provides superior performance and longevity when properly maintained. Of course, let's talk about agricultural technology, which represents some of the most sophisticated engineering achievements of the Tudor period. Your plow isn't just a simple tool for breaking ground. It's a precisely designed instrument that must balance soil cutting, earth turning, draft requirements, and durability considerations while being maintainable by people with basic blacksmithing skills. And yet, the most impressive aspect of Tudor agricultural technology isn't individual tools, but integrated systems that coordinate multiple technologies to achieve complex results. Your grain production involves specialized plows, harrows, sickles, flails, winnowing baskets, and storage containers that work together as a technological ecosystem designed to maximize efficiency while minimizing labor requirements. Still, remember that Tudor innovation happens within severe resource constraints that force creative solutions most modern engineers never encounter. When metal is scarce and expensive, tools must be designed to use minimal materials while maximizing effectiveness. When transportation is limited, equipment must be repairable using locally available resources by modern standards. Tudor technology would seem impossibly crude and labor-intensive, but remember that it successfully supported populations, created agricultural surpluses, and maintained complex civilizations without fossil fuels, electricity, or global supply chains. The efficiency measures that matter aren't mechanical power or processing speed. They're resource conservation, durability, and local maintainability. If you thought modern manufacturing was complex, think again. Tudor craftsmen routinely create products that require integrating multiple materials with different properties, balancing competing design requirements, and achieving precise tolerances using only hand tools and traditional techniques that have been passed down through generations of practical experience. That's right, your local blacksmith can create metal tools that are stronger, more durable, and more precisely fitted to their intended applications than many modern manufactured equivalents. Using techniques that combine metallurgical science, mechanical engineering, and artistic craftsmanship in ways that modern specialization rarely achieves. To be fair, this artisanal approach to technology does have limitations that modern mass production overcomes. Individual variation in quality, limited production capacity, and dependence on skilled craftsmen create supply constraints that modern manufacturing systems are specifically designed to eliminate. Meanwhile, your experience with Tudor technology reveals something that modern people often forget. The relationship between user and tool is fundamentally different when every tool is individually made, locally maintained, and personally understood by the people who depend on it. Your tools aren't anonymous manufactured objects. They're extensions of your own capabilities that have been specifically adapted to your needs and working conditions. Your household technology represents perhaps the most sophisticated technological integration in Tudor society. Cooking, heating, lighting, food preservation, textile production, and basic manufacturing all happen in the same space, using interconnected systems that maximize efficiency while minimizing resource consumption and safety hazards. Of course, the absence of modern power sources means that Tudor technology must harness human energy, animal power, and natural forces like wind and water to accomplish work that modern machines handle automatically. This constraint forces innovative approaches to mechanical advantage, energy storage, and process optimization that would challenge modern engineers. And yet, Tudor people often achieve better results than modern technology in areas where quality, durability, and environmental integration matter more than speed or convenience. Traditional building techniques create structures that last for centuries. Traditional food preservation creates products with complex flavors and superior nutrition. And traditional manufacturing creates objects with character and craftsmanship that mass production rarely matches. Still, don't romanticize Tudor technology too much. The physical demands are enormous, the learning curve is steep, and the margin for error is often smaller than modern safety standards would tolerate. People regularly suffer injuries that modern workplace safety regulations specifically prevent. And equipment failures that would be minor inconveniences today could represent major disasters in a world without replacement parts or professional repair services. Let's be clear about something that would make modern disaster preparedness experts lose sleep. Your Tudor community has no early warning systems, no emergency services, no government disaster relief, and no insurance policies to cushion the impact when nature decides to demonstrate just how little control humans actually have over their environment. Instead, you have traditional wisdom, community cooperation, and the kind of practical resilience that comes from knowing that your survival depends entirely on your ability to adapt quickly to circumstances that could destroy everything you've worked to build. Your relationship with natural disasters begins with the understanding that they're not exceptional events that disrupt normal life. They're regular features of existence that must be planned for, prepared against, and survived. Through using whatever resources and strategies your community has developed over generations of similar challenges. To be fair, this constant preparation for disaster creates communities that are often better equipped to handle genuine emergencies than modern populations that rely on external assistance and professional emergency services. The most common disaster you'll face is crop failure, which can result from too much rain, too little rain, late frost, early frost, plant disease, insect infestation, or any combination of factors that remind you just how little control farmers actually have over their primary source of survival. Crop failure isn't just an economic setback, it's a potential death sentence for families and communities that depend entirely on local food production. Meanwhile, while you're learning to read weather patterns with the intensity of someone whose life depends on accurate forecasting, remember that Tudor communities have developed sophisticated strategies for managing agricultural risk that would impress modern disaster planners. Crop diversification, seed saving, food preservation, and community resource sharing create multiple layers of protection against the crop failures that could otherwise destroy entire villages. Your community's approach to disaster preparedness involves everyone, because everyone's survival depends on collective resilience rather than individual insurance policies. Families with good harvests share with families whose crops failed, understanding that the situation could easily be reversed next year, and that community survival depends on mutual aid during emergencies. Sound familiar? It should, because anyone who's lived through natural disasters, economic crashes, or pandemic lockdowns will recognize the importance of community networks, resource sharing, and mutual aid that government services can't always provide. The difference is that Tudor communities live with this level of mutual dependence constantly rather than temporarily. Of course, let's talk about extreme weather events, which can destroy in hours what took months or years to build. Severe storms can flatten crops, destroy buildings, kill livestock, and disrupt transportation systems that connect your community to broader economic networks. Without modern weather forecasting or storm-resistant construction, these events represent existential threats that require immediate and effective community response. And yet, Tudor communities have developed response strategies that often prove more effective than modern disaster management approaches. Everyone knows their role during emergencies. Everyone has practiced coordinated response procedures, and everyone understands that individual survival depends on collective effectiveness during crisis situations. Still, remember that natural disasters in Tudor England often trigger secondary crises that can be more dangerous than the initial event. Crop failures lead to food shortages that make people vulnerable to disease. Severe weather disrupts transportation that delays essential supplies. Economic disruptions caused by disaster recovery can destabilize communities for years after the original emergency has passed. By modern standards, Tudor disaster response would seem impossibly primitive and dangerously under-resourced. But remember that these communities successfully survived centuries of natural disasters, climate variations, and environmental challenges without the technological and institutional resources that modern societies consider essential for disaster management. If you thought modern climate change was challenging, think again. Tudor people lived through the Little Ice Age, a period of climatic cooling that significantly affected agricultural productivity, growing seasons, and winter survival rates throughout Europe. They adapted to changing conditions through modified agricultural practices, altered seasonal routines, and increased community cooperation. That's right, your Tudor community is already dealing with climate change, just in the opposite direction from current global warming trends. The cooling climate means shorter growing seasons, more severe winters, increased crop failures, and greater challenges for livestock survival. Communities that can't adapt effectively to these changing conditions simply don't survive. To be fair, the Tudor approach to environmental challenges does have some advantages over modern disaster management approaches. Local knowledge accumulated over generations provides better understanding of specific regional risks than generalized emergency plans. Community-based response systems can mobilize more quickly than bureaucratic relief organizations. Traditional building techniques and agricultural practices are often better adapted to local environmental conditions than standardized modern approaches. Meanwhile, your personal disaster preparedness involves skills that most modern people have never developed: reading natural warning signs, preserving food for long-term storage, maintaining equipment under adverse conditions, coordinating with neighbors during emergencies, and making life-or-death decisions with incomplete information and limited resources. Your household disaster planning must account for multiple types of potential emergencies simultaneously: fire prevention and response, food storage for extended shortages, medical supplies for treating injuries when professional help isn't available, and evacuation procedures for situations where staying home becomes impossible. Of course, the psychological aspects of living with constant disaster risk create mental adaptations that would be useful for modern people facing increasing environmental uncertainty. Tudor people develop emotional resilience, practical flexibility, and community solidarity that help them maintain hope and effectiveness even during extended periods of crisis and uncertainty. And yet, the constant stress of living with environmental vulnerability takes a psychological toll that modern people with safety nets and professional emergency services rarely experience. The knowledge that next year's harvest could fail, that severe weather could destroy your home, that disease could devastate your community, creates anxiety levels that would challenge modern mental health approaches. Still, don't assume that Tudor communities are helpless victims of natural disasters. Instead, they're remarkably adaptive societies that have developed sophisticated strategies for managing environmental risk, maintaining community resilience, and preserving essential knowledge and resources through extended periods of crisis and recovery. Let's be honest about something that people living with artificial lighting and climate control rarely consider. Your psychological state in Tudor England is intimately connected to seasonal cycles in ways that would fundamentally alter your personality, social relationships, and entire approach to life planning. The rhythm of your existence follows natural patterns that modern people have largely lost touch with, creating both constraints and opportunities that would challenge anyone accustomed to the artificial consistency of modern indoor environments. Your emotional landscape changes dramatically with the seasons in ways that go far beyond simple weather preferences. Spring brings hope and renewed energy after surviving another winter, but also anxiety about the coming year's agricultural challenges. Summer provides abundance and social celebration, but also the pressure of intensive work during the growing season. Autumn offers harvest satisfaction and preparation time, but also growing awareness of approaching winter hardships. To be fair, this seasonal psychological rhythm creates a natural balance between intensive work periods and necessary rest times that modern year-round productivity expectations often disrupt. Tudor people work harder during summer months, but also rest more completely during winter months, creating sustainable patterns of effort and recovery that prevent the chronic exhaustion common in modern work cultures. Meanwhile, while you're adjusting the psychological rhythms that follow natural light cycles rather than artificial schedules, remember that seasonal changes affect not just your individual mood, but your entire community's social dynamics. Village social life intensifies during winter months when outdoor work is limited, creating opportunities for extended socializing, storytelling, and collaborative indoor projects. Your relationship with seasonal change involves both practical and psychological preparation that begins months before actual seasonal transitions. Summer preparations for winter involve not just food preservation and firewood gathering, but mental preparation for months of limited sunlight, restricted outdoor activity, and closer social contact with family and neighbors. Sound familiar? It should, because anyone who's experienced seasonal affective disorder or simply noticed how their mood changes with daylight availability will recognize the psychological impact of seasonal light variation. The difference is that Tudor people built their entire social and economic systems around these natural psychological cycles rather than fighting against them. Of course, let's talk about winter depression, which affects Tudor communities in ways that modern people with electric lighting and indoor heating rarely experience. The combination of limited daylight, cold temperatures, restricted movement, and reduced food variety creates psychological challenges that require community-based coping strategies and cultural practices specifically designed to maintain mental health during difficult months. And yet, Tudor winter activities often provide psychological benefits that modern entertainment systems can't match. Collaborative indoor projects, extended storytelling sessions, detailed craft work, and intensive social interaction create opportunities for skill development, relationship building, and cultural transmission that busy modern lifestyles often lack. Still, don't underestimate the psychological challenges of living without artificial lighting during winter months. Your active day shrinks dramatically during the shortest days of the year, forcing adjustment of work schedules, social activities, and sleep patterns in ways that modern people rarely experience except during power outages or camping trips. By the same token, spring awakening in Tudor England provides psychological relief and renewed hope that modern people living with consistent artificial environments might struggle to appreciate. The return of longer days, warmer temperatures, fresh food, and outdoor activity creates dramatic mood improvements that feel like psychological resurrection after winter's psychological death. If you thought modern seasonal celebrations were meaningful, think again. Tudor seasonal festivals serve essential psychological functions for communities that depend entirely on natural cycles for survival, social organization, and emotional well-being. These celebrations aren't just cultural traditions. They're community mental health interventions that help people navigate seasonal psychological challenges. That's right. Your community's seasonal celebrations are specifically designed to address the psychological needs created by seasonal transitions. Spring festivals celebrate renewal and hope during the emotionally difficult transition from winter scarcity to summer abundance. Harvest festivals provide psychological closure and community gratitude during the transition from summer abundance to winter preparation. To be fair, modern people who deliberately align their lifestyle with seasonal cycles often report higher levels of life satisfaction and psychological well-being than people who try to maintain consistent year-round schedules and activities. The Tudor approach to seasonal living might offer lessons for addressing modern problems with depression, anxiety, and social isolation. Meanwhile, your seasonal psychological experience includes awareness of natural cycles that extend beyond annual weather patterns. You understand multi-year patterns in weather, crop productivity, and animal populations that affect long-term planning and psychological preparation. This broader temporal awareness creates psychological perspectives that modern people focused on quarterly reports and annual goals rarely develop. Your seasonal work rhythms create natural variety in daily activities, social interactions, and psychological challenges that prevent the monotony and repetitive stress that characterize many modern occupations. Different seasons require different skills, different social arrangements, and different mental approaches to problem solving and goal achievement. Of course, the psychological impact of seasonal change also includes exposure to natural beauty, dramatic weather events, and environmental variation that provides constant stimulation and wonder for people whose entertainment doesn't come from screens and manufactured experiences. The psychological benefits of daily exposure to natural environments are well documented by modern research, but rarely experienced by contemporary urban populations. And yet, seasonal psychological adaptation in Tudor England also includes acceptance of limitation, scarcity, and environmental constraints that modern people often find psychologically difficult. Learning to be content with seasonal restrictions, reduced activity levels, and limited resource availability requires mental skills that consumer culture actively discourages. Still, remember that Tudor people often report higher levels of seasonal satisfaction and psychological resilience than modern people who have access to much more comfortable living conditions but less meaningful connection to natural cycles and seasonal rhythms that have shaped human psychology for thousands of years. Let's be clear about something that might shock people who romanticize small-town life. Village politics in Tudor England were more complex, more cutthroat, and more personally consequential than most modern corporate boardroom dramas, because every decision affected people who had to live with each other permanently in a space roughly the size of a modern shopping mall. If you thought office politics were challenging, wait until you experience a social system where your enemies are also your neighbors, your economic partners, and potentially your children's future in-laws. Your daily existence involves navigating relationships with people you cannot avoid, cannot replace, and cannot escape, which creates social dynamics that would make modern relationship therapists weep with professional fascination. The village reeve who controls work assignments might also be your brother-in-law, your business partner, and your primary competitor for the miller's daughter's attention. That's right. Every social interaction carries multiple layers of meaning, consequence, and future implication. To be fair, this intense social complexity also creates remarkably sophisticated skills in diplomacy, conflict resolution, and coalition building that modern people rarely develop. When you can't block someone on social media or find a new job in another company, you learn to manage relationships with a subtlety and patience that would impress international diplomats. Meanwhile, while you're mastering the art of village social navigation, remember that every family has its own internal politics that affect the broader community's social balance. The ongoing dispute between the Miller family and the Baker family about water rights doesn't just affect milling and baking. It influences marriage negotiations, work partnerships, religious seating arrangements, and festival planning for years to come. Sound familiar? It should, because anyone who's lived in small communities, served on volunteer boards, or worked in family businesses will recognize the challenge of maintaining professional relationships with people whose personal lives intersect with yours in multiple complicated ways. The difference is that Tudor people can never leave these relationships behind or start fresh somewhere else. Of course, Let's talk about the gossip networks that serve as both entertainment and intelligence systems in communities, where information is power and privacy is impossible. Every conversation is potentially public knowledge within hours. Every domestic dispute becomes community discussion, and every family's private business becomes everyone's concern when it affects broader social stability. And yet, this intense social scrutiny also creates accountability systems that often prevent problems from escalating beyond community management. When everyone knows everyone else's business, antisocial behavior gets addressed quickly, community standards get enforced consistently, and social problems get resolved through collective pressure rather than formal intervention. Still, the psychological pressure of living under constant social observation would challenge modern people accustomed to anonymity and privacy. Your reputation affects not just your social standing, but your economic opportunities, your family's marriage prospects, and your access to community support during emergencies. One serious social mistake can affect your family's prospects for generations. By modern standards, Tudor village economics would seem impossibly complex and personally demanding. But remember that these systems successfully supported entire communities for centuries, using principles that modern economic theories often overlook or dismiss. The success of Tudor communities depended on economic relationships that were simultaneously more personal and more sustainable than modern market-based exchanges. Your economic planning must account for not just your own family's needs, but your obligations to extended family, your role in community projects, your responsibilities to social superiors, and your commitments to mutual aid systems that provide security in exchange for ongoing participation. If you thought modern budgeting was complicated, try managing an economy where every transaction has social implications that extend years into the future. That's right. When you trade grain for tools, you're not just exchanging commodities. You're establishing credit relationships, demonstrating social status, maintaining family alliances, and participating in community systems that could determine whether your children survive the next harvest failure. Every economic decision is also a social decision with consequences that affect multiple generations. To be fair, this integration of economic and social relationships often produces more equitable and sustainable outcomes than pure market transactions. When your trading partners are also your neighbors, your children's teachers, and your potential source of emergency assistance, everyone has incentives to maintain fair dealing and long-term relationship health. Meanwhile, your participation in the Tudor economy requires skills that most modern people never develop. Assessing quality through sensory evaluation, negotiating complex multi-party exchanges, calculating value across different types of goods and services, and managing credit relationships without formal contracts or legal enforcement mechanisms. The seasonal nature of Tudor economics creates additional complexity that would challenge modern people accustomed to steady income and consistent pricing. Your wealth fluctuates dramatically throughout the year based on harvest timing, weather conditions, and community demand cycles that require strategic thinking and careful resource management to navigate successfully. Of course, let's delve deeper into the spiritual landscape that shapes every aspect of Tudor consciousness in ways that secular modern culture would find both fascinating and incomprehensible. Your worldview includes layers of spiritual meaning, supernatural causation, and cosmic significance that extend to the smallest details of daily life in ways that would fundamentally alter how you understand everything from personal responsibility to natural phenomena. Your relationship with the supernatural begins with the understanding that visible reality is only a small part of a larger cosmic system that includes angels, demons, saints, spirits, and various supernatural forces that actively influence human affairs in ways that can be understood, predicted, and sometimes influenced through proper behavior and appropriate rituals. And yet, this isn't primitive superstition or ignorant folklore. It's a sophisticated system for understanding and managing uncertainty in a world where so much remains genuinely beyond human control or scientific explanation. Traditional spiritual practices often provide practical guidance for navigating complex situations, maintaining community harmony, and finding meaning in suffering that can't be prevented or explained through rational analysis. Still, the psychological demands of living a spiritually active universe where your moral choices affect not just your personal fate, but potentially your entire community's relationship with divine forces create levels of moral responsibility and spiritual anxiety that modern secular culture rarely experiences. Your daily spiritual practices include not just formal religious observances, but constant attention to omens, signs, seasonal rhythms, and spiritual influences that require interpretation and appropriate response. This creates a richly meaningful existence where nothing is purely random or spiritually neutral. But it also creates constant psychological pressure to behave correctly and interpret events properly. Meanwhile, your community's spiritual life includes both official Christian doctrine and much older traditional practices that connect your village to spiritual forces, ancestral wisdom, and natural cycles that have sustained human communities for thousands of years. This spiritual synthesis creates remarkably resilient belief systems that provide guidance for almost any situation that might arise. If you thought modern environmental challenges were complex, think again. Tudor communities routinely managed renewable resources, maintained soil fertility, preserved biodiversity, and coordinated human activities with natural cycles in ways that sustained both human prosperity and environmental health for centuries. Without modern scientific understanding or technological solutions, your approach to resource management begins with the understanding that everything in your environment has multiple uses. Nothing should be wasted, and long-term sustainability matters more than short-term efficiency. This creates approaches to agriculture, forestry, water management, and waste handling that often prove more environmentally sound than modern industrial practices. That's right. Your Tudor community is practicing sophisticated environmental stewardship using traditional knowledge systems that modern permaculture designers and sustainable agriculture experts study and attempt to recreate using scientific methods and modern technology. To be fair, Tudor environmental practices weren't motivated by abstract environmental concern, but by practical necessity in communities that depended entirely on local resources and couldn't afford to damage the natural systems that sustained them. Environmental sustainability wasn't a choice. It was a survival requirement that shaped every aspect of community planning and individual behavior. Meanwhile, your personal environmental knowledge includes detailed understanding of local ecosystems, seasonal variations, plant and animal behavior, soil conditions, and weather patterns that would impress modern environmental scientists. This knowledge develops through daily observation and practical application over years of direct dependence on environmental conditions for survival and prosperity. Your community's approach to environmental management includes sophisticated rotation systems, selective harvesting practices, habitat preservation techniques, and resource-sharing arrangements that maintain ecological balance while supporting human communities. These practices represent centuries of accumulated wisdom about sustainable relationships between human communities and natural environments. Of course, Tudor environmental stewardship also includes acceptance of natural limits, seasonal constraints, and environmental variations that modern technology often tries to overcome rather than accommodate. Learning to work with natural cycles rather than against them requires different thinking patterns and different approaches to planning and problem solving than modern industrial culture typically employs. And yet, perhaps the most profound aspect of Tudor life involves psychological adaptations that modern people would find both challenging and potentially liberating. Living without modern conveniences requires mental skills, emotional resilience, and social strategies that contemporary culture often fails to develop, but that might prove essential for navigating an increasingly uncertain future. Your Tudor psychological toolkit includes acceptance of limitations, comfort with uncertainty, appreciation for simple pleasures, and ability to find meaning in work that directly contributes to survival and community welfare. These mental skills often prove more valuable for long-term life satisfaction than the goal achievement and consumer satisfaction that drive much of modern psychological well-being. Still, don't romanticize the psychological challenges of Tudor life. The constant physical demands, social pressures, and survival uncertainties create stress levels that would challenge modern mental health approaches, especially for people accustomed to modern comfort levels and individual autonomy. Your daily psychological experience includes both constraints and freedoms that modern people rarely encounter. You have less individual choice, but more community support, less privacy, but more social connection, less physical comfort, but more meaningful work, less material security, but more spiritual certainty about your place in the cosmic order. Meanwhile, your Tudor community provides psychological resources, meaningful roles, clear expectations, spiritual frameworks, seasonal rhythms, and mutual support systems that address fundamental human needs for purpose, belonging, and significance in ways that modern individualistic culture often struggles to provide. Despite much greater material prosperity and technological capability, by the time you've fully adapted to Tudor life, you've developed psychological skills and social relationships that might prove more valuable than modern conveniences for creating lasting satisfaction and resilience in an uncertain world. The lessons aren't about returning to medieval living conditions, but about understanding what human communities need to thrive, regardless of their technological or material circumstances. Let's be clear about something that would fascinate anyone who's ever wondered: how isolated communities connected to broader economic and cultural networks. The arrival of traveling merchants in your Tudor village represents more than just commercial opportunity. It's your primary window into the wider world, your source of news from distant places, your connection to luxury goods and exotic ideas, and occasionally your ticket to adventure that extends beyond the boundaries of your familiar agricultural existence. Your relationship with traveling merchants begins with the understanding that these aren't just salespeople pushing products you don't need. They're essential links in economic chains that stretch across England and into continental Europe, bringing goods that your community genuinely requires for survival and prosperity, while taking away local products that generate the only cash income most villagers will ever see. The merchant's arrival creates excitement that modern people accustomed to daily deliveries and constant commercial availability would find difficult to understand. To be fair, when shopping opportunities appear maybe 4 times a year, when exotic goods like spices, fine textiles, and metal tools are otherwise completely unavailable, and when the merchant brings news from London, Paris, and other distant cities that might as well be different planets, their arrival becomes a community festival that combines commerce, entertainment, and cultural exchange. Meanwhile, while you're experiencing the Tudor equivalent of Black Friday shopping crossed with international news reporting, remember that these merchant relationships require negotiation skills, quality assessment abilities, and social intelligence that modern retail interactions rarely develop. Every purchase is a personal negotiation. Every transaction establishes future credit relationships, and every interaction provides information that might prove valuable for months to come. Your preparation for the merchant's visit begins weeks in advance as your community accumulates surplus goods, plans major purchases, and organizes collective negotiations that maximize everyone's purchasing power while maintaining social harmony. Sound familiar? It should, because anyone who's ever participated in group buying, community-supported agriculture, or cooperative purchasing will recognize the economic advantages and social challenges of coordinated commerce. Of course, let's talk about the goods themselves, which represent technologies, materials, and craftsmanship that your local community simply cannot produce. Iron tools forged in specialized smithies, textiles woven on professional looms, spices grown in distant climates, and manufactured goods that require urban workshops and international supply chains provide essential resources that make rural life possible while connecting your village to global economic systems. And yet, the merchant's prices reflect not just production costs, but transportation expenses, storage fees, and profit margins that account for the risks and complexities of moving goods across vast distances using primitive transportation systems and unreliable security arrangements. What seems expensive by modern standards often represents remarkable value given the logistical challenges involved in bringing these goods to your remote location. Still, merchant visits also introduce economic pressures and social tensions that peaceful agricultural communities would prefer to avoid. Sudden availability of luxury goods creates desires that local production cannot satisfy. Price negotiations constrain community relationships, and exposure to urban standards of living can make rural simplicity seem less appealing than it did before these alternatives became visible by modern standards. The selection would seem limited and the prices outrageous. But remember that Tudor merchants are providing services that modern global supply chains handle automatically: risk assessment, quality control, transportation coordination, and market intelligence that allows rural communities to participate in economic systems that would otherwise be completely inaccessible. If you thought modern retail was high pressure, think again. Tudor merchant negotiations involve not just immediate transactions, but long-term relationships, community politics, and social dynamics that affect everyone's economic prospects for months after the merchant has moved on to other villages. Your negotiation skills, social standing, and community relationships all influence what prices you pay and what credit terms you receive. That's right. The merchant remembers not just your payment history, but your social standing, your family's reputation, your community's reliability, and your potential as a long-term customer who might justify special treatment, extended credit, or early access to particularly desirable goods. These relationship investments pay dividends over years of repeated interactions. To be fair, successful Tudor merchants develop remarkable skills in cultural adaptation, language facility, economic intelligence, and social diplomacy that would impress modern international business professionals. They must navigate different regional customs, local political situations, varying currency systems, and community social dynamics while maintaining profitable operations across vast territories. Meanwhile, the merchant's news-bringing function provides your primary source of information about political developments, economic conditions, and cultural changes that affect your community's future prospects. Royal policies, military conflicts, trade route disruptions, and religious changes that seem distant and abstract suddenly become personally relevant when explained by someone who has witnessed their effects in other communities. Your interaction with merchants also provides rare opportunities for social mobility and economic advancement that your agricultural community cannot offer internally. Occasionally, a young person with appropriate skills and adventurous temperament might join a merchant's traveling operation, gaining access to wider worlds and economic opportunities that rural life simply cannot provide. Of course, merchant visits also remind your community of its relative isolation and limited economic opportunities, while simultaneously providing essential connections to broader commercial networks. This creates psychological tensions between satisfaction with local life and awareness of alternatives that might offer greater material prosperity or cultural sophistication. And yet, most community members ultimately appreciate both the merchants' services and their eventual departure, which allows village life to return to its familiar rhythms without the disruptions that external commercial relationships inevitably create. The ideal relationship provides access to necessary goods and valuable information while maintaining community autonomy and cultural continuity. Still, remember that your Tudor merchant experience demonstrates something that modern global commerce often obscures. Successful long-distance trade depends on personal relationships, mutual trust, and cultural understanding rather than just on efficient logistics and competitive pricing. The human elements of commerce that modern systems try to eliminate are often essential for economic relationships that benefit everyone involved. So here we are, after walking through a day, a season, and a lifetime in Tudor England. Let's be honest about what this thought experiment has really shown us. If you think modern life is challenging, you've just gained a perspective that should make you grateful for problems you probably take for granted, while simultaneously developing a profound respect for the ingenuity, resilience, and community spirit that allowed millions of people to not just survive, but thrive under conditions that would break most modern individuals within a week. To be fair, this isn't about romanticizing the past or suggesting that we should return to pre-industrial living conditions. Tudor life was harsh, uncertain, and constrained in ways that would be intolerable to people accustomed to modern freedoms and opportunities. The infant mortality rates were horrifying, the physical demands were brutal, and the social restrictions were suffocating by contemporary standards. And yet, something remarkable emerges from this historical deep dive. People living under these conditions developed forms of community solidarity, practical wisdom, and psychological resilience that modern society has largely lost in its pursuit of individual freedom and material prosperity. The interdependence that was forced by circumstances created social bonds that were both more demanding and more supportive than anything most modern people experience. Meanwhile, while we're congratulating ourselves on modern progress, remember that Tudor farmers were solving complex problems with limited resources, maintaining sophisticated social systems without modern communication technology, and creating meaningful lives within constraints that would challenge the most creative modern lifestyle designers. Their solutions might seem primitive, but they worked well enough to support entire civilizations for centuries. Your hypothetical Tudor experience demonstrates something that modern people often forget. Human happiness and fulfillment aren't primarily dependent on material abundance or technological convenience. They depend on having meaningful work, supportive community relationships, clear social roles, and a worldview that provides purpose and explanation for both suffering and joy. That sound familiar? It should, because the fundamental human needs that Tudor people met through traditional social arrangements are the same needs that modern people struggle to meet through individual effort and market-based solutions. The difference is that Tudor solutions were embedded in community life, while modern solutions often isolate people from the very social connections that make life meaningful. Of course, let's not get too carried away with medieval nostalgia. Tudor people would have eagerly embraced modern medicine, global communication, abundant food supplies, and individual freedoms if they had been available. They weren't choosing traditional lifestyles because they preferred them. They were making the best of the only options available to them. Still, their example demonstrates that humans are remarkably adaptable creatures who can create satisfying lives under almost any circumstances, provided they have community support and meaningful challenges that match their capabilities. The skills they developed, cooperation, resourcefulness, patience, practical wisdom, and the ability to find joy in simple pleasures are exactly the skills that modern people need to navigate an increasingly complex and uncertain world. By modern standards, your Tudor farmer existence would seem impossible to endure. But remember that modern standards are based on assumptions about comfort, convenience, and individual autonomy that are both historically recent and globally unusual. Most humans throughout history have lived more like Tudor farmers than like contemporary middle-class consumers, which suggests that the modern lifestyle, rather than traditional arrangements, represents the historical anomaly. If you thought this exploration of Tudor farming life was just an exercise in historical curiosity, think again. The challenges that Tudor people faced, resource scarcity, environmental uncertainty, social inequality, political instability, and the need to maintain community solidarity under difficult circumstances are becoming increasingly relevant. As modern societies grapple with climate change, economic inequality, and social fragmentation. That's right, Tudor farmers might have more to teach us than we initially expected. Their strategies for building resilient communities, managing resources sustainably, creating meaningful work relationships, and maintaining hope during difficult times aren't just historical curiosities. They're practical models that could inform modern approaches to contemporary challenges. To be fair, we can't and shouldn't try to recreate Tudor social arrangements in modern contexts. But we can learn from their emphasis on community interdependence, their integration of work with social life, their acceptance of natural limits, and their ability to find meaning and celebration within constrained circumstances. Meanwhile, your hypothetical journey into Tudor life has hopefully accomplished something more important than just historical education. It's provided perspective on modern complaints, gratitude for modern conveniences, and recognition that human creativity and community spirit can overcome challenges that seem insurmountable from a distance. The next time you're frustrated with your internet connection, annoyed by your commute, or overwhelmed by modern life's complexity, remember your Tudor farmer alter ego, who would have traded places with you in a heartbeat while simultaneously teaching you valuable lessons about resilience, community, and the art of making the most of whatever circumstances life provides. And yet, perhaps the most important lesson from this exercise isn't about the past at all. It's about recognizing that every era presents its own unique combination of challenges and opportunities, and that human happiness depends less on external circumstances than on our ability to build meaningful relationships, contribute to something larger than ourselves, and find purpose in the daily work of creating and maintaining the communities that sustain us. Of course, you don't actually have to wake up as a Tudor farmer to benefit from their example. You can apply their lessons about community cooperation, resource conservation, seasonal awareness, and finding joy in simple pleasures to your modern life, creating a lifestyle that combines the best aspects of both traditional wisdom and contemporary opportunities. Still, remember that this thought experiment was designed to do more than just entertain or educate. It was meant to demonstrate that human beings are capable of far more resilience, creativity, and community spirit than modern individualistic culture generally recognizes. The Tudor farmers who survived and thrived under impossible conditions weren't superhuman. They were ordinary people who developed extraordinary skills for working together, making do with limited resources and maintaining hope in the face of uncertainty. Your modern life, with all its complexity and convenience, presents different challenges, but requires the same fundamental human capacities that allowed Tudor communities to flourish: the ability to cooperate with others, adapt to changing circumstances, find meaning in daily work, and maintain hope for the future despite present difficulties. Let's be clear about the ultimate message of this historical journey. Whether you're dealing with crop failure in Tudor England or career uncertainty in the modern world, Whether you're navigating village politics or office dynamics, whether you're celebrating harvest festivals or holiday parties, the fundamental challenge remains the same. How to create a meaningful life in community with others, using whatever resources and opportunities your particular time and place provide. And if that's not a lesson worth learning from our hypothetical Tudor farmer, then I don't know what is.